Hey everyone, I hope that your week is going well. I just wanted to check in with you as we are working on Module 3.2. Of course, this week we are going to complete reading tweets, which many of you are already doing, and a blog post to round out our reading of Brian DeLay's War of a Thousand Deserts. I really enjoyed the discussion that we had both on Twitter last week and on the discussion board regarding his methodological approaches, the sources that he used. His book is really interesting as well because he has that appendix at the back where he shows us how he organized and kind of thought through the quantification of the counts that he had available regarding violence enacted mostly by Comanches, but also by other indigenous groups. So we were able to have some good conversations about the choices that he made in terms of how to interpret that data. And that is something I really want to hammer home. Hopefully it's not too obvious, but I think it bears repeating and underscoring this reality that historians make choices when they write books. So when we tell the story of the past, when we create narratives, we necessarily have to make choices because the historical record is always going to be incomplete. We're always going to be confronted with historical evidence that was created by imperfect human beings who have their own biases and their own perspectives on the events that we're trying to study. So for that reason, it is so important to collect as many different perspectives from as many different sources as possible. And we noted how exhaustive DeLay's attempts at doing that were. He noted some places where he didn't have as much information as in others. Also, I think it was, I'm trying to remember, I think it was James that read Cynthia Radding's review of the book and pointed out her critique that he kind of took the Mexican newspapers too much at face value. I think that was a fair critique, and I replied on Twitter as well, though, that we also have to recognize that the periódicos oficiales, they were sometimes called the diarios oficiales, they were the official newspapers of each Mexican state. The federal government in Mexico City also had one as well. The thing that's important to remember about those is that quite often all those newspapers did was reproduce verbatim different pieces of legislation or the goings-on in the halls of the legislature. Very rarely would they sort of report on events. So that's also something to think about in terms of the critique that Radding made, but also the ways that DeLay used those newspaper sources, because that's something that I've had to struggle with as well as I've tried to use newspaper sources in Chihuahua, looking at the situation on the New Mexico-Chihuahua border. The newspapers in El Paso and Deming and Columbus were all pretty colorful in terms of providing interpretation and the kinds of different bias that you might expect from a 19th century newspaper. That wasn't quite the same thing in Mexico, and I don't know that her critique really fleshed that out. So again, I'll get off that soapbox, but just wanted to point out there are a lot of complexities and nuances to thinking through sources beyond just the fact that we know we need to use them critically. I did want to point out that I added quite a few different comments on the discussion board for Module 3.1, so please go back through and look at those if you get a chance. I particularly wanted to point out the places where some of us asked questions that were more about the actual historical events than about Brian DeLay's methodologies or sources. And I tried to suggest some ways that you could turn those questions about events into questions about methodology while still keeping it in the context of those events. So again, please give those a look. Hopefully that'll help us as we turn next week to Rachel St. John's Line in the Sand. I'm very much looking forward to that. It was a book that had came out right as I was in the middle of writing my dissertation. And so it had a lot of helpful insights in terms of thinking about how the physical boundary was surveyed and kind of laid out on the ground, as well as how it defined and created new townships, new communities, new kinds of interactions in the Chihuahua and Sonoran deserts where such had never existed before. Also is interesting to see the ways in which a very open border between Mexico and the United States from the 1850s through the turn of the 20th century and into the Mexican Revolution became a much more closed border with revolutionary violence after 1910, then with concerns about migration after that point. So I think what we can get out of her reading, and hopefully I'm just priming us for next week as well, is thinking about how the border that we know today, especially, was not always the way it was. And so it has been created as such under very specific cultural, social, and historical processes. We're going to read about those the next few weeks, not only with St. John, but then going to Julian Lim's book, and then we'll look at the foundation of the Border Patrol after that with Kelly Little Hernandez's work. Okay, I think those were the main points I wanted to make. I'm also going to be posting a blog entry along with all of you this weekend, Monday at the latest, looking at the what I want to do with mine is kind of add another layer to our conversations about DeLay's work as we look toward St. John's, so that we can think about kind of the big picture of methodology. So what are some of the obstacles that historians face as they try to create or try to write borderlands and transnational histories? So I'll try to talk maybe a little bit about the distinction between those two concepts. They overlap a lot, but they're not the same thing. So I'll leave it there. Have a great rest of the week, and I'll talk to you soon.